What if one ordinary night could shatter everything you thought you knew about your life? What if the person you trusted most, the one you built your world around, was hiding a truth so devastating it divided your life into before and after? This is the story of Richard Hale, a self-made millionaire whose wealth gave him everything except the one thing he valued most: loyalty. He had the perfect house, the perfect marriage, and a life most people only dream about. But fate has a cruel way of revealing what hides in the shadows. One evening, returning home earlier than planned, Richard expected nothing more than a warm smile, maybe a quiet dinner, maybe laughter by the fire. Instead, what he saw when he opened that door froze his blood, crushed his soul, and changed him forever. This is not just a story about betrayal, it's a story about a man who discovered the ugliest truth in the most unexpected moment, and how that truth forced him to rebuild his entire world from the ashes of his broken heart. Stay with me, because once you hear what Richard saw, you'll never forget it. The world saw Richard Hale as a man who had it all. He was the kind of millionaire who didn't flaunt his money, but carried it in the way he walked, in the calmness of his voice, in the confidence of someone who had built an empire from the ground up. His fortune came from real estate, but his reputation came from generosity. People admired him, envied him, and some even hated him quietly. But no one ever imagined that behind his perfect life was a truth waiting to shatter everything. On a cold Thursday evening, Richard's schedule shifted unexpectedly. He had planned to be away at a business meeting until late into the night, but the deal wrapped up hours earlier. For once, instead of calling his wife to announce his return, he decided to surprise her. The thought carried warmth. He wanted to see her smile when he walked through the door. They had been married for 10 years, and though work consumed much of his life, Richard never doubted the foundation of trust he believed they shared. As he pulled up to his mansion, the driveway lights flickered on, illuminating the sleek black car he had gifted his wife on her last birthday. The sight filled him with a quiet pride. He always wanted to give her the best, to make her feel cherished. He walked toward the front door, briefcase in hand, his mind running through thoughts of a quiet dinner, maybe a bottle of wine, perhaps laughter by the fire. But the moment the key turned in the lock, something felt wrong. The house was too quiet, yet not in a comforting way. There was an unfamiliar tension in the air, as though the walls themselves were holding a secret. Richard's instincts, sharp from years of high-stakes business, whispered that something wasn't right. He set down his briefcase softly and moved through the hallway, the sound of his polished shoes muffled by the thick carpet. As he approached the living room, faint murmurs reached his ears, voices low, hurried, intimate. His heart tightened. It wasn't the kind of conversation you had with a friend or neighbor. It carried a tone of secrecy. He stopped at the edge of the doorway, his breath caught in his chest. Through the slight opening, Richard saw his wife seated on the couch. She wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man, someone he didn't recognize immediately. But it wasn't just his presence that sent a shock through Richard's body. It was the way she leaned toward him, the way her hand brushed against the man's arm with a tenderness Richard hadn't felt in years. For a moment, his world froze. The millionaire who could calculate risks, foresee market crashes, and negotiate billion-dollar deals suddenly stood powerless in his own home. His wife's soft laughter, a sound he once lived for, now cut through him like a blade. He wanted to storm into the room, demand answers, let his rage consume him. But instead, he stayed still, his mind battling itself. Was this a misunderstanding? Was he reading too much into what he saw? His heart begged him to believe that. But then the man leaned closer, whispering words that made his wife's face soften in a way Richard hadn't seen in years. It was enough. His chest ached with betrayal. He stepped back quietly, gripping the wall for support. 1,000 images raced through his mind, memories of their vacations, the nights they stayed awake dreaming about the future, the moments she swore she loved him more than life itself. Were all those lies? He retreated to his study, closing the door behind him with trembling hands. For the first time in decades, Richard Hale, the man known for unshakable composure, felt his entire life slipping out of control. But what came next wasn't fury. It wasn't an explosion. Instead, it was a chilling silence. He sat at his desk, staring at the leather-bound notebook where he kept personal thoughts, the only private thing he had ever allowed himself beyond numbers and contracts. With shaking fingers, he wrote down what he had seen, not as a record for others, but as a way to convince himself it was real. The house carried on as if nothing had happened. He heard faint footsteps upstairs, the closing of a door, the sound of water running. His wife believed he was still away. She had no idea he was under the same roof, no idea her betrayal had been uncovered. The hours crawled. Richard didn't confront her that night. He didn't have the strength. He sat in the dim light of his study, replaying the scene again and again, each time feeling the knife twist deeper. By midnight, his resolve hardened. If his life was to be divided into a before and after, then he needed to decide what after meant. When dawn broke, Richard rose with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He didn't scream, he didn't rage, he planned. That was who he was, a strategist, and if his marriage was nothing more than a facade, then he would uncover every truth hidden behind it. The first step was silence. He walked into the kitchen the next morning as though nothing had happened. His wife, startled to see him, smiled and asked why he was home so early. He returned the smile, his face betraying none of the storm inside him. He told her the meeting ended quickly, and he thought he'd surprise her. She laughed softly, relieved. She didn't know he had already seen too much. But Richard wasn't playing the part of a loving husband anymore. He was a man on a mission, watching closely, noting every detail, every inconsistency, and the deeper he looked, the more he realized what he saw that night was only the surface of something far darker. His life had already changed forever, but he had no idea the true storm was yet to come. Richard Hale moved through his days with the precision of a man wearing a mask. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. He kissed his wife's cheek in the mornings, attended board meetings, and shook hands with investors. But inside, everything had changed. His heart no longer trusted the warmth of her smile. His eyes no longer believed the softness in her touch. And every word she spoke seemed weighed down by suspicion. He became an observer in his own home, studying the smallest details. He noticed how often her phone was face down, how quickly she closed messages, how she disappeared for errands that stretched longer than necessary. Once, he trailed her car, staying far enough behind to remain unseen. She didn't go to the boutique she claimed she drove to a quiet cafe on the other side of the city. Richard parked down the street, his hands gripping the wheel, and watched through the window as she leaned across a table toward the same man he had seen in his living room. The way she touched her necklace, the way her lips curved in secret smiles, it was all the proof he needed. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss, deeper than any deal gone wrong. This was his wife, the woman he trusted with his life, the woman he thought he was building forever with. And yet, she had built a second life behind his back, brick by brick, lie by lie. But Richard was not a man who rushed into war without strategy. He knew one thing with certainty: if his life had already been divided into before and after, then the after must be built with truth. He hired a private investigator, discreet and reliable. Within weeks, every shadow came to light. Photos, messages, receipts. His wife's affair stretched back over a year. The man she met wasn't just anyone. He was one of Richard's own business rivals, a man who had once tried and failed to outbid him on a major property deal. The revelation twisted the knife deeper. This wasn't only betrayal of love, it was betrayal of loyalty, of trust, of everything sacred. His wife had shared his secrets, his home, his life's most vulnerable pieces with someone who would use them against him. One evening, armed with undeniable truth, Richard decided it was time. He invited her to dinner, preparing the table with her favorite dishes. The air smelled of rosemary and wine, the kind of night she might have once considered romantic. She came down dressed elegantly, smiling, unsuspecting. They ate in silence until Richard placed a single envelope beside her plate. "Open it," he said, his voice steady, controlled, confused. She tore it open and pulled out the photographs. At first, she blinked as though she couldn't process them. Then her hands trembled, her face drained of color. She looked up at him, eyes wide with panic. "Richard, I can explain," she stammered. But he raised his hand, silencing her. "Don't insult me with lies. I've built my entire life on seeing through deception. And I saw through you." Tears welled in her eyes, but he felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, only finality. "Do you realize," he whispered, "that everything I thought I knew about us, every memory, every promise, is now poisoned?" She reached across the table, but he pulled back. "Richard, it was a mistake. I never meant a mistake as forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is a harsh word spoken in anger. What you did was a choice, repeated, planned, enjoyed. His voice grew colder, and you chose him. The room fell into silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. For the first time in their marriage, Richard felt like a stranger in his own home that night. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't break a single glass. He simply told her to leave. She begged, she pleaded, but he stood firm. His wealth had given him power in the world, but that night, his strength came not from money but from resolve. That, as she walked out with a suitcase hastily packed, Richard felt his life split in two. There was the before, the years of blind trust, of building a life on a foundation he thought was unshakable. And now, the after, a future that would never again look the same. The weeks that followed were a storm. News of their separation spread through society's circles like wildfire. Some whispered, some judged, some pitied. But Richard didn't care. He had weathered financial crashes, market betrayals, political schemes. This personal devastation was worse, but it also forced him to look inward. Alone in his mansion, he walked the halls not with despair but with reflection. He realized how much of himself he had given away in the pursuit of success. He had built towers of glass and steel, but he had neglected the walls of his own heart. His wife's betrayal was her choice, but he could not deny the truth that he had allowed distance to grow between them. Thinking money and gifts were enough, for the first time in years, Richard sought not another deal, but his own healing. He poured himself into charity work, into mentoring young entrepreneurs, into causes that touched souls rather than bank accounts. People who once only knew him as a millionaire now began to see him as something more, someone human, someone who had suffered and rebuilt. One evening, months later, he stood on the balcony of his home, looking at the sunset. The same house that once echoed with betrayal now carried a different silence, a peaceful one. The betrayal had broken him, yes, but it had also freed him. Freed him from illusions, from blind trust, from the weight of a love that was never real. His life was divided into two chapters. The first had been built on dreams of perfection. The second was carved out of truth, pain, and resilience. And as he breathed in the evening air, Richard Hale's millionaire, betrayed husband, but still unbroken, knew one thing with certainty: the after might not be what he had planned, but it was his, and for the first time in years, it was real. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories like this to life. Make sure to subscribe to Legacy Ignited and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your presence means more than words can say.